My God.
Just touch the screen. The screen. Got it. Thank you.
Noam, can you hear me?
Yeah, just give me a few seconds to get something set up here.
As you're setting up, let me just say a few words. So as you can see, we have Noam Chomsky here today, who's going to be talking to us about the foundations of syntax. This is part of a seminar we're having this semester on argument structure. And one of the papers that we're reading is Remarks on Nominalization, which is Chomsky's 1970 paper, which started off this whole study of the relationship between nominalizations and syntax and argument structure. So I asked him to come and speak today about that and related issues, and we're happy to have him here. With that, I'll yield the floor to you, Noam.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually not going to say much about how nominalizations work, how to handle them. My general feeling, for what it's worth, is that the approach that's sketched in the paper you looked at is pretty much on the right track, but I won't go into it now. What I'd like to do instead is talk about some background issues that led to the paper in the first place. These are issues that are very much alive today, even if sometimes in a different form. I think it's worthwhile to think about the circumstances of the 1960s when the paper was written, mid-1960s. The field was very different from what it is today. Generative grammar existed almost nowhere, apart from MIT. It was the one place where there was any work done on it, which is a little bit strange. MIT is a great university, but it lacks any of the fields that have traditionally been relevant to linguistics. No language departments, no anthropology, no social sciences, no humanities. I think that's changed by now, but in the 60s, it was an engineering school just beginning to move towards general science. There was nothing in any major university in the world. I should say that this has been replicated in every other country. So I see Richie there in France, and then in all of Europe, the generative grammar developed from the suburbs of Paris when Richie went there, not from Paris. In Holland, it was in Tilburg, not in Amsterdam, and pretty much the same throughout the world. But that was the situation in the 1960s in the United States. Cognitive science was in its infancy. There were dominant views in linguistics, psychology, philosophy of language, linguistics itself. They were structuralist, behaviorist, in such an extreme form that a long and rich tradition that radically disagreed was simply wiped out. It was dismissed as not even worth discussing, if anyone even remembered it. Naive nonsense now surpassed, like astrology. You don't bother talking about it. At mid-century, students in linguistics and especially philosophy were considered a little bit daft if they read anything that was not part of the current orthodoxy. The things I remember very well and continued for many years. Well, there were ideas that had prevailed before the 20th century. In fact, back to classical antiquity, they had been almost entirely forgotten, dismissed. This was the tradition that regarded language as audible thought, words of William Dwight Whitney into the 19th century, or that actually took language to be identical with thought. That was Wilhelm von Humboldt's position, ideas that traced back to antiquity. The tradition was a tradition that had become particularly rich since the 17th century scientific revolution. It was the era that was called general and rational grammar. It was general because it tried to be universal, hold for all languages. It was rational in the sense that it sought explanation. And the main thing that it sought explanation for was an insight of Galileo's, reiterated shortly after in the by the logicians, linguists in the Weyl monastery, Arnaud, Lancelot, and others, the idea that which they found amazing and incomprehensible, that with a small number of symbols, it would be possible to construct an infinite number of thoughts. And having done so, then even to convey to others who have no access to our minds what the innermost workings of our minds are. We're amazed that such a miracle could be accomplished. A couple of centuries later, this was repeated by Frege, almost the same words, Gottlob Frege, founder of modern logic and linguistic semantics. And in fact, I think they were right. It is an amazing achievement. We don't understand it now. We only have a very partial understanding of it. Then they had no understanding of it. That was the insight that led to the general and rational grammar tradition with its emphasis on universality and on explanation. The last major figure in this tradition was Otto Jespersen, about a century ago, developed pretty similar views. Totally forgotten. He was unknown to 20th century linguistics. There's actually a review of this by historian of linguistics, Julia Falk, article in, I think, Language a couple of years ago. She discussed how Jespersen had been totally blacked out in 20th century linguistics, so he was an early 20th century figure. And the same with the whole tradition leading up to it. There was a sense that we developed something new, structuralist, behaviorist approach, everything else could be forgotten. Well, that's the 20th century actually constituted a very sharp break from a long tradition. And this new approach, the 20th century approach, language is taken to be a system of communication, evolved from animal communication insofar as evolution was discussed at all. As for what language is, I'll give you a couple of representative quotes. I'll omit the Saussurean conception that language is a social contract of some kind, talking now mainly of the areas of linguistics that regarded it as basically as a property of individuals, maybe communities. So say Leonard Bloomfield, the most prominent American linguist of the early 20th century, for him, language is a matter of training and habit. That was maintained well into the 1960s. The most influential figure in philosophy of language and mind, Quine, his view was that language is a complex of dispositions to verbal behavior in which speakers of the same language have perforce come to resemble one another. The other leading figure in contemporary philosophy of language, Ludwig Wittgenstein, took pretty much the same position. It was recognized that there is some innovation in performance, kind of a hint of the Galilean challenge. The innovation was considered pretty marginal. It was a matter of analogy, and the examples that were given were mostly from morphology. Well, American linguistics was quite explicit about these matters, to its credit. It defined itself as a taxonomic science based on procedures of analysis, which could be applied to any materials. It was assumed, in fact, explicit, that languages could vary pretty much arbitrarily, no general grammar, and each one had to be investigated pretty much on its own. Actually, it's worth noting that the same view was held in biology at the time, that organisms varied so widely they could take almost any form. Each one had to be studied on its own. That idea has been totally abandoned in biology. Deep conservation has been discovered, fundamental laws of form, which very sharply restrict the number of possible organisms. It's even been suggested that there may be a universal genome with minor modifications around the periphery, not accepted but taken seriously, radical difference from the 50s. And my own feeling is we're moving pretty much in the same direction in linguistics. Well, going back to the mid-century, the deepest thinker in the field, Zellig, was very explicit about it. If you take a look at his classic book, Methods in Structural Linguistics, it begins by rejecting altogether the idea that there should be a theory of language. So I'll just quote his opening remarks. He describes the work as a discussion of the operations with which the linguist may carry out in the course of his investigations, not a theory of structural analyses which result from these investigations. The research methods are arranged here in the form of the successive procedures of analysis imposed by the working linguist upon his data. That's the field. And alternative procedures are perfectly legitimate, looking at language from a different point of view. They yield different analyses of phonemic or other structures. Actually, in 1965, Harris took a much stronger position. He said there are no competing theories. Pitting of one linguistic tool against another is senseless. It's an aberration with sociological roots, but not part of linguistics. Alternative procedures of analysis can be applied as a basis for a description of the whole language, bringing out its various properties from alternative points of view. But that's the whole story, not 1965. Notice this means that it was essentially a closed field. It was done. The procedures were available, could apply them to anything. There were basically no problems. Can't have a problem, you just apply the procedures to data. I was a student at that time, late 40s. I remember very well the feeling among students. It was, this is kind of fun, you know, it's interesting to find out the phonemes of Cherokee and so on. But what happens when we've done it to every language? We're done, field's over. there's nothing more to do. Actually, that was very widely believed. Some of you have heard this. The first talk I gave at a graduate student, as a grad student, was at about the only other university that had linguistics department. Chicago was invited there, and the leading conversation with the leading professor of linguistics there, Norman McQuown, specialist on American Indian languages. Asked him what he's doing. He said, he's just collecting data because there's nothing more to do. Harris's methods were out. Computers were coming along. Pretty soon you'd be able to automate the procedures. So what's the point of doing anything? Just collect data that you can feed into the procedures. We're finished. That was the prevailing attitude and a legitimate one. If language is just a matter of training and habit, complex of dispositions to respond, evolved from animal communication, apply procedures to anything, then what is there to do? Well, that was the prevailing atmosphere, overwhelmingly so, in the 50s and the 60s. Well, generative grammar in the beginning of the late 40s, early 50s, it did return to the tradition in many ways. This was without any awareness because it had entirely been lost. Nothing was known about it. The history of linguistics, which is not a great field, I should say, had nothing about it. Well, the generative grammar did return to the tradition. One way was by regarding the internal language, it's called I language in contemporary usage, essentially as a system for generating thoughts with externalization in some sensory motor medium, kind of an ancillary matter, hence communication even more so. That's become sharper and better established in recent years. If there's a couple of minutes later, I may say something about it. Actually, Chris's work, recent work, carries these conclusions much farther. His forthcoming book. Well, another departure of generative grammar from the structuralist behaviorist consensus was a return to the goals of general and rational grammar. Now that's actually by now general in a new sense, namely the principles of the language faculty, UG, not generalizations holding for languages, which is the older sense of the term, but rational in the old sense, searching for explanation. The first ideas that were developed early on were what were called the need for explanatory adequacy, what was sometimes called a language acquisition device. Explanatory adequacy meant a theory of the language faculty would satisfy that condition if it showed how a language could be acquired from primary linguistics data, but that was the essential idea back from the early 50s. Well, both of these departures from the structuralist behaviorist conception, these were almost unintelligible. They still are in many circles. If you want to get a very good sense of the intellectual environment at the time, I'd suggest reading a very interesting book by Charles Hockett. He was maybe the most sophisticated theorist of structuralist behaviorist linguistics. This is 1968, his book called State of the Art. It describes what he calls the structuralist consensus, the taxonomic consensus. And it's very much worth reading. He does mention, in fact, a lot of it is concerned with generative grammar, but simply to say that it's just some form of mysticism, which obviously we can't take seriously. go back to, say, Quine, the leading philosopher of language. He regarded it all as just what he called folly, just a failure to understand elementary methodological precepts, which lead you directly to radical behaviorism. Well, I'll give you one personal example, which has interested me for 75 years since the paper was written. The first paper of mine that anybody read was in an engineering journal, the Institute of Radio Engineers, back in 1956. There was no possibility of publishing anything in linguistics journals, but there was some interest in the engineering profession. There's a paper called 3 Models for Analysis of Language. Now, the history of that paper is pretty interesting. The 3 model, and very instructive. The 3 models were, first of all, finite automata, lowest level. Second level was rewriting systems basically going back to the logician Emil Post, universal rewriting systems to anything, as he showed, are equivalent to universal Turing machines. You add conditions, you get context-sensitive languages. Add more conditions, you get context-free languages. Add still more conditions, you can get back to the first model, finite automata. Notice that the title of the paper was 3 models. There was a 3rd model, transformational grammar. And the point of the paper, entire point of the paper, was to show that the first 2 models were useless for language. The only model that we could take seriously is the 3rd one, because that was the only one that offered any hope of getting explanations. Now, if you look at the history of discussion of this paper, it's now almost 75 years, there is no discussion at all of the 3rd model. It's unmentioned. There's an enormous amount of discussion about the 2nd model. It's a large part by now of formal linguistics, automata theory, a lot of development about context-free grammars, what are called mildly sensitive context-free grammars, interesting relations to their various kinds of automata, but nothing about the 3rd model, because that was unintelligible. How can you be interested in explanation? It's not a topic. Okay, that lasts until today. I've been looking out of personal interest, of course, to see if I could find a single reference anywhere to the fact that the paper was an objection to the first 2 models and was proposing a 3rd model. I haven't found a word. The idea of explanation remains pretty much unintelligible. Well, that was going back to the 60s. That was the general atmosphere in Cambridge, where these topics were most alive, but actually quite generally. Hockett's book is a case in point, Harris's position. But the problem of explanation is the background for remarks on nominalization. It was a quite isolated concern at the time. And in fact, if you look at the discussion since, most of it is about the technicalities of the paper. Can you do it this way? Can you do it that way? And not about the motivation. The motivation was, can we find explanation? And that still remains a pretty exotic theme, which is kind of interesting, because in the sciences, it's the only theme, it's the main one. Well, explanation is closely related to simplicity. This was a topic extensively discussed by Nelson Goodman back in the 40s, early 50s. I was a student of his. The guiding principle, the basic idea that he developed is that the simpler and more restricted the devices in a theory, the deeper the explanations. Now, that's a major issue in philosophy of science. So going back to Galileo's empirical precept was that nature is simple, and it's the task of the scientists to show it. That's what science is about, trying to show that nature is simple because that's what it is. Now, this guiding principle is an empirical principle, but it's been spectacularly successful. It leads to all of modern science. In linguistics, if you think about it, it leads to what's now called the strong minimalist thesis. There's a lot to say about that, but put it aside. In the sciences, it's commonplace. So the basic principle was expressed very simply by physicist Jean-Baptiste in his Nobel Prize lecture. He described the essential art of science as reduction of complex visibles to simple invisibles. That's what science is about, not a taxonomic study of the complex visibles, but trying to find out what are the simple invisibles that lie behind it. And they must be simple under the Galilean principle. Similar thoughts have been articulated by many other leading figures. I'll quote one great mathematician, Hermann Weyl, observed that, quoting him, "The assertion that nature is governed by strict laws is devoid of all content. If we do not add the statement that it's governed by mathematically simple laws, the astonishing thing is not that there exist natural laws, but that the further the analysis proceeds, the finer the elements to which phenomena are reduced, the simpler the fundamental relations become, and the more exactly do they describe the actual occurrences." That's modern science since the 17th century. Actually, these precepts also bear on the nature of evolution in a way which has consequences for study of the evolution of language. So if you think about evolution, you can distinguish 3 stages: general evolution. First stage is some disruption takes place, maybe a mutation or gene transfer or a bacterium swallowing another microorganism, breakthrough, which led to complex cells, eukaryotic cells, complex life, just accident. That's the first stage, lots of possibilities. Second stage is reconstruction. Nature proceeds to reconstruct the new entity in the simplest way. That's what the Galilean precept argues and seems to be correct for evolution. That's the second stage of evolution, the most interesting stage. Then comes the third stage, that's winnowing. Now, the outcomes that reproduce more effectively prevail. That's natural selection. That suggests a reasonable scenario for language evolution. This time I'll say something about it. It seems that language never reached the third stage, the winnowing stage, no natural selection, just reached the second stage. And that's what linguistic theory is about. There's a lot of it. These actually have been central concerns of generative grammar since its origins. There's a lot about this in print. I won't go into it here. Well, let's go back to explanations. There are 2 kinds of problems that an explanation can face in explanatory theory. One problem is it can be too weak. Another problem is it can be too powerful. If it's too weak, it means it fails to accommodate some relevant phenomenon. If it's too powerful, it fails to exclude impossible phenomena. The former flaw, too weak, is much less serious. It can usually be fixed up by small revisions or maybe add some bells and whistles. The latter, too strong, is very serious. That commonly requires radical revision, often throwing out the whole theory. So I'll give you a rough analogy. Suppose I were to go to a physics conference and announce that I have a great new theory of elementary particles, handles all the known particles and all the particles known to be impossible. Wouldn't receive much applause. Make a side comment about that. That's highly relevant today. Very fashionable today are what are called deep learning approaches. They elicit lots of excitement. There's a lot of debate about whether they can handle this or that phenomenon, maybe parasitic gaps or garden path sentences or something else. But there's a far more serious problem, which is ignored. These approaches all fail totally because they can easily handle impossible languages, often much more easily than actual ones, which means that the deep learning approaches tell us nothing whatsoever about language. It's about my going to the quantum theory conference. And this one seems irremediable. Just doesn't seem any way to modify them so they can bar the languages that are impossible. Actually, Ritchie pointed out once that there aren't any languages that are the reverse order of actual languages. Deep learning has no problem with that, works fine. Same way as for the actual ones. And same with all sorts of other impossible languages you can make up. So the whole field of deep learning is irrelevant to language. In fact, irrelevant to mental operations, irrelevant to science. It doesn't mean it's useful engineering. So say the Google translator for somebody who's monolingual like me is pretty useful, but it's brute force. It's an engineering achievement. It tells you nothing about language. In general, one should be cautious about the excited articles in the press about what machines can do. You know, they can write something that looks like an article. Now that's a brute force engineering achievement. When they talk about what machines can do, of course, they mean what programs can do. And a program is just a theory written in a notation that computers can implement. So what they're saying is there's a theory that can do boring things, which are irrelevant to language and mind. It's the way to interpret it. Well, these are actually the kinds of issues that were in the background for the paper that you've read. There, at the time, were two basic kinds of rules. There were the basically combinatorial rules and the displacement rules. Combinatorial rules were phrase structure grammar. Displacement rules were transformational grammar. They have remote descendants today, external and internal merge, the only two valid kinds of merge. But both phrase structure grammar and transformational grammar were far too strong. They suffered from the second flaw. So in a phrase structure grammar, there's nothing to stop you from having a rule that says AP arrow CPP, let's say. It's a fine rule. Impossible rule, but a fine rule. The rules also beg the question. Like they used symbols like NP and AP, which are supposed to be related somehow to N and A, but that's a hidden assumption. What makes them related? S arrow NP VP is no different from X arrow YZ. The rest of it is just hidden assumptions. So they were no good for structure rules, far too unconstrained. And the same was true of transformational rules. They were so loosely characterized, they could do almost anything. Well, the most extensive study at the time was a PhD thesis, later book by Bob Lees on English nominalizations. That was a transformational analysis of nominalizations, which had a lot of results, but the devices were far too rich. All sorts of impossible nominalizations could be handled by these devices. Well, get back to remarks on nominalization. That was the problem I was concerned with, an effort to cut all that down. So the first move was to distinguish different kinds of nominalizations, gerundive and derived. The transformational approaches are very easy for gerundive nominalizations, so let's save that. They got very arcane for the derived normalizations. And the proposal in the paper is that these should be handled differently with no transformations on the basis of a lexical theory. It was actually the first effort in generative grammar to deal with the lexicon, lexical features, and so on. As far as phrase structure grammar is concerned, the paper suggested that that be eliminated totally in favor of what later came to be called X-bar theory, which did eliminate many of the problems, brought up some other ones. Well, that was what the paper was about. As I say, I think it was more or less on the right track, but the problems it faced are still very much alive. So let me say a word about them. As I mentioned, the earliest work, early 50s, was concerned with what was called explanatory adequacy. That's basically the condition of learnability. Show any theory of language has to be able to show that languages can be acquired, and just the right ones, not the wrong ones. You have to show that the right ones can be acquired, the wrong ones can't be acquired. That's explanatory adequacy. There was another problem in the background, the problem of evolvability. A theory of language is going to have to show how it could have evolved under the conditions of human evolution. That was in the background, couldn't really be discussed. The reason it couldn't be discussed is that if you're trying to study the evolution of something, you have to know what the something is. You can't study the evolution of something if you don't know what it is. And at least until the 1990s, there was no conception of language that could possibly have evolved. The concept, the notions were much too complex, much too arcane, and just not the kind of thing that nature could possibly evolve. I think now we have a conception, but we didn't then. Well, it was known that there are a lot of problems with both of these things. On the matter of learnability, the problem is what's called poverty of stimulus. It was known to be a very serious problem then. We now know it to be a far more serious problem. More recent work in acquisition of language has shown some pretty astonishing things. Much of it the work of our late friend and colleague, Lila Gleitman, who showed in very interesting experimental work that very young children, 2-3 year-old children, have mastered a huge amount of their language. They can't produce it, but they understand it. That includes the meaning of words, which is still pretty miraculous. With just a few presentations, children acquire the full meaning of words, which when you look at them are quite rich and complex. And they do this at a very rapid rate with almost no, basically just triggering. Same with complex principles of a sentence structure. So the problem of poverty of stimulus is vastly greater than it was thought to have been. This was actually extended by work of Charles Yang, cognitive scientist and linguist, who did careful statistical studies of the actual language available to a 2 or 3-year-old child. Turns out once you bring in the property known as Zipf's law, descriptive property, turns out that the data are extremely sparse. You don't even get many bigrams, let alone trigrams. So all of this shows that the poverty of stimulus problem is enormous. The other problem of evolvability has also become much more difficult. Back around the 60s, one of the many statements of mine, which is regarded as outlandish and outrageous, that's quite a lot of them, was in aspects where I said that, I said mistakenly that we, instead of simply regarding language acquisition as a matter of, say, a couple of years of experience, maybe we should think about processes that go back millions of years in the evolution of language, which play a role in laying the basis for acquiring language. Well, that was considered ludicrous. Language is just a complex of dispositions, training, and habit. But in fact, it was wrong because it's not millions of years. Recent work has shown that it's probably a very short, brief window. We now have genomic analysis that shows that humans began to separate roughly 150,000 years ago. That's not very long after humans emerged. Maybe 300,000 years in evolutionary time. These are blinks of an eye. If you take a look at the archaeological record, there's essentially no evidence of any symbolic activity prior to humans. Maybe a mark on a bone or something like that, but virtually nothing. Shortly after the appearance of humans, again in evolutionary time, there's a huge explosion of complex symbolic activity. Pretty astonishing. Another personal anecdote. I visited France back in the early 50s, and in those days, the Lascaux caves, which had recently been discovered, were still open. They're closed now. But we were able to get into the Lascaux caves. And when you look at the actual paintings on the walls, it is really phenomenal. Picasso said that when he saw them, he said, we haven't learned anything in tens of thousands of years. And you can understand why when you look at them. You don't really get the full sense of it from the reproductions. And they were late. That was maybe 20, 30,000 years ago, but it goes back to maybe 80,000 years ago, which is not long after humans began to separate. Well, the separation of humans was in groups which seemed to have the same cognitive capacities and the same language faculty, which means that it was in place before 150,000 years ago. There's no indication that it was in place before humans emerged that would have shown up in symbolic activity. So it's a fair guess that language emerged pretty much along with modern humans. That gives you a very narrow window for evolution of language. So we have a conundrum. The study of learnability, the learnability condition requires that the internal structure be extremely rich in order to carry the child from virtually no evidence to rich knowledge. That seems to require a very rich internal structure. On the other hand, the evolvability condition seems to indicate that it's very limited, very impoverished, because it had to develop in a very narrow period. The third part of the conundrum is the generality condition of traditional general and rational grammar, whatever linguistic theory is, has to cover all languages, and they seem to be extremely diverse. So that means adds to the conundrum. And that's basically the problem that the theory of language has faced, I think, pretty much for 75 years, becoming much more serious in recent times. Well, there is, I think now, for the first time, actually, a possibility of cutting through the Gordian knot of developing theories of language simple enough so that they could have emerged along with humans in virtually a tiny window of evolutionary time, based on operations which are so simple that they have to exist if language is to exist at all. That still leaves a biological problem, but it carries it like, what are they neurologically? There are actually some ideas about that, but it carries the study of the evolutionary problem as far as the study of language can carry it, down to operations which must exist if language is to exist at all. Then there's recent work which I think shows, you can look into it, that if you bring in natural law, which for a computational system like language and principles of computational efficiency, if you bring these in to the simplest operation, you can find genuine explanations for major properties of language. First ones in the history of the field, some fundamental properties. If that works out, it's a new era, I think, in the study of language, where you can, for the first time, begin to deal with the full problems of explanation and legitimate explanation in terms showing how the complex visibles are reduced to simple invisibles. Well, that's the current situation. But anyway, that was the background for the paper you read, Remarks on Nominalization, and the same basic questions in different form, I think, arise today. Looking at the time, I'll stop there.
Noam, are you willing to take a few questions?
Hmm?
Okay, so the floor is open for questions. One?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Just going back to the idea of external merge and internal merge, and having these two kind of classes for merge, I was wondering like how head movement or head adjunction would fit into the story of having the merge.
Problem of adjunction.
Yeah, head movement, or I guess my question is, what is your current view on the head movement when it comes to merge, and classifying them into these two classes?
Head movement. Head movement.
I'm sorry. So what is the problem of adjunction? It's a problem. I don't see any very easy way of dealing with it. It looks like a different kind of operation in a different dimension. I suspect that there's, the brain is not two-dimensional. There are many dimensions, and there may be independent operations which are outside the framework of the two-dimensional study of external and internal merge. So just things attached to a structure in a different dimension. I presume that's going to be the way to deal with it, but we don't have a good theory of adjunction. And there are very interesting problems. Some interesting papers by Željko Bosković, for example, studying many different problems that arise when you look at the various kinds of adjunction operations, how they differ and so on. So I think it's pretty much an open field for investigation.
Thank you.
Okay, is there another question?
Yeah. I should, there are a number of other problems which I think we can now, for the first time, begin to deal with, and in fact find genuine explanations for. One of them is there are two main problems that have resisted analysis for 75 years. One of them is head movement. The other is unbounded, unstructured sequences. Head movement is used constantly, but it's a completely illegitimate operation. There's no way to formulate it within any theory that's ever been proposed. Not in any merge-based theory, not in transformational theories. It just, I mean, we use it, but in ways that just don't make any sense. I think we can now provide pretty powerful arguments that it doesn't exist. It's just a property of morphological amalgamation of functional features that's outside of language, outside of the internal system that's thought generated. That doesn't seem to have head movement. With regard to unbounded sequences, that's always been a very serious problem back to the 50s. One problem is it can't be handled by any kind of rewriting system, even the universal ones. I have to make a qualification there. The universal systems are equivalent to Turing machines. So there's a way to encode it in Turing machines, but not to read it off the rewriting rules the way you do for context-sensitive and context-free grammars. You'd need an infinite number of rules. It was thought for a while you might be able to do it with generalized transformations, but Howard Lasnik showed about 60 years ago that that doesn't work, 50 years ago. So there's basically no way to handle them. I think we can now do it for the first time. There's some material in print about that. But a junction is still, I think you can imagine how it might work, but it hasn't been worked out.
We have a question from a student. You want to ask your question?
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit more about what your view is of the social application of studying theoretical syntax, because in addition to being, a renowned syntactician, you're also, known for your political and social analysis. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit more on that as well.
I'm sorry, but I didn't catch it. Chris, are you running this thing?
Yeah. He says he wants.
Could you activate the live transcript option?
Yeah.
That would help me follow. I don't hear very well. I'm sorry.
Okay, good. I activated. Could you repeat? Could you speak louder?
Sure, yeah. I just said thank you for your talk. If you could speak a little bit more about what your view is of the social.
Thank you very much. Okay.
He's repeating the question now.
If you could speak a little bit more about your view of the social application of studying theoretical syntax.
Social application of studying theoretical theory of language.
Theoretical syntax.
Theoretical syntax. Well, I mean, if you're asking for immediate social application, like how does it deal with problems of white supremacy? Language is neutral. You can be a racist, you can be an anti-racist. The language doesn't care. But at a broader, in a deeper sense, I think there is a connection. If you ask, what's special about human beings? Not the fact that we can run, other animals can run. Not the fact that we can jump, other animals can jump better. Not the fact that we can navigate. The desert ants out in my backyard do way better than any human can do. So we're very primitive in that cognitive respect. The thing about humans, there are basically two things about humans that are really truly distinctive. One of them is language, the other is thought. Thought in any sense that we can grasp. I mean, maybe the dogs under my desk are doing something, but it's not thought in anything like the human sense. Well, if there are two properties that pretty much define the species, first question is, what's the relation between them? The simplest relation would be identity. Maybe they're identical. That's 2,000 years of tradition up until the 20th century. It's actually the kind of work that Chris is working on right now. Maybe they're the same thing. Language is just what generates thought. Thought is what is generated by language. Well, going back to social applications, any kind of meaningful social activism is going to be based on some kind of conception of what humans are like. You want your activism to be for the common good, for whatever's good for humans. And that leads us to ask, what's good for humans? Well, there is a tradition expressed explicitly by people like Humboldt, so others, that what's essential to humans, this is the basis for classical liberalism, contemporary anarchism, which is its outgrowth. What's essential to humans is free creative activity. Anything that impinges on that is illegitimate. Anything that forces a person, and this shows up most clearly in language, in what's sometimes been called the creative aspect of language use, that Galilean challenge that I mentioned earlier, which so amazed Galileo and the Weyl logician linguists, that led Descartes, in fact, to set up a second substance, res cogitans, a thinking substance, separate from body, because it encompasses language and mind. Well, maybe those two things are really the same at the core. If they are, we have a deep understanding of human beings with a lot of consequences. One obvious consequence is that getting a job, which is everyone's aspiration in the 20th century, is a fundamental attack on human rights and human dignity, which is the way it was understood for 2,000 years, from the Greeks and the Romans through the classical liberal period up to the 19th century, working class and radical farmers movements who regarded subordination to a master as just totally intolerable. That was killed in the 20th century, but I don't think it's far below the surface. Well, that's one social application. And there are many others when you think about what is legitimate and what is illegitimate authority. Does it impinge on human rights? Arises in education, for example. Should education be what was ridiculed in the 18th century as pouring water into a vessel? Nowadays, it's called teach to test. It's the official position in the United States. You pour water into a vessel, then some of the water comes out in what's called a test. Not only the worst possible kind of education, but the kind that was totally ridiculed during the Enlightenment. What was proposed was laying out a string along which the student will progress in his or her own way. That is, general structure, but encouraging individual exploration. The idea was that anything that doesn't arise from your own nature, from your own inquiry, from your own creative activities, doesn't become part of you. And we all know that incidentally from our own educational experiences. We all had courses which were so stupid that we didn't want to pay any attention to them. And you studied for the exam and passed the exam, and 2 weeks later you forgot what the course was about. On the other hand, if there's a course which encouraged you to think, to work things out, do it your own way, maybe within a structured framework, then it becomes part of you. And that's real education. Well, that's the same sort of story. It's the way language works. It's not a matter of training and habit. It's a matter of flowering from within. It's all in there. It just flowers when it's triggered. As far as social applications are concerned, I think they're rich, but at a deeper level, not at the level of can you apply it to today's particular problem, but can you apply it to a conception of what human society and human institutions ought to be like?
Are there any further questions for Professor Chomsky? That was a great question. Thank you. Yes, Lila. Go ahead. Loudly.
Is it having UG and there are some I for example, I'm not native speaker of English, and can I be native speaker one day?
Okay. Did you get the question, Noam? She says she's not a native speaker of English, but in the theory of UG, can she be a native speaker one day?
Interesting. Basically, can an adult become a native speaker of a new language?
Yeah.
There are people who can do that. Actually, one of them is Richie Kane. For me, it's impossible. So there's a spectrum of opinion. You're seeing both ends of it right in front of you. Most people are like me. They find it pretty hard. There are a few people like Richie, Ken Hale, a couple of others who somehow are able to do it, can pick up. I used to joke with Ken Hale, my friend and colleague, telling him he was just immature. He'd never gotten past infancy. So he still was in the critical period where he could pick up any language natively, but it's a very rare property. For most people, it becomes quite hard roughly after puberty seems to be the kind of a cutoff point. And it's very striking. I'll just tell you a personal anecdote. About 40 years ago, I went to Italy. That's where the Pisa lectures were, principles and parameters. And I went with my family, included my first wife and a 20-year-old daughter and a son who was 10 years old. My wife and I and my daughter all wanted to learn Italian, so we were studying really hard to learn Italian. My son didn't want to learn it. He refused to learn it. He didn't want to go to Italy, didn't want to leave his friends. He was being coerced. He swore to us he was never going to learn a word. After we were there for about a month, if the telephone rang, he had to answer. He's the only person who could speak fluently and understand what was said. You just can't help it if you're a child. If you're a child and you're put into an environment where language is spoken, it becomes part of you. If you're older, it becomes a chore, except for some special people who haven't matured.
Okay. Are there some other questions from the undergraduates here? Do they have any questions from the grads? Yeah? Yeah, Guy?
Yeah, so I'm wondering about what you said about deep learning. Do you think there's potentially some application in having these kind of opaque learning processes if we input certain like parameters or limitations in order to see if that makes certain things impossible? Do you think that could be a potential application of deep learning, or do you really think the whole enterprise is totally useless?
Well, remember what when you talk about a machine, what you're talking about. A machine is a program. What's a program? A program is a theory written in an odd notation so that a computer can implement it. So I think I would translate your question as saying, can we find a theory of language which is accurate enough so that if we decide to implement it in a computer, it'll give the right results? Yeah, that's the problem of linguistics. Can we find, if you construct a theory that's precise enough, then you can program it. If it has hidden assumptions and impossible principles, then you can't program it. So it's basically asking, can we find a theory of language which provides genuine explanations, which don't have hidden assumptions, which are based on principles which satisfy the basic conditions of the conundrum, learnability, evolvability, that covers all languages but no impossible languages. If we could find such a theory, if we could make it precise enough, if we could do what, say, Chris and Ed Stabler did for the theories of merge, formalize it, you could do that, then you can program it. And then you won't need deep learning principles at that point. You'll notice that the whole deep learning approach, for a kind of trivial reason, is sort of irrelevant to anything having to do with human cognition. It uses astronomical amounts of data and enormous computing capacity, batches of supercomputers. Has nothing to do with what any organism's doing, but that's a superficial reason for the irrelevance. If you could have the right theory of language, you wouldn't need all that stuff. Just as a child doesn't need it. Okay, the child doesn't have a battery of supercomputers and astronomical amounts of storage. Just does it because it's built that way. And it's built that way because it has that program built into it. So if we could figure out what that program is, you could essentially program it into a computer and simulate it.
Okay. Yeah, please, from the back.
So in order for a chat, so in order for children to be good at acquiring language from a young age, they have to have this rich internal structure. So I'm wondering what happens to all of that structure after the critical period? Like, where does it go?
Well, that's not just a question about language. It's a question about everything. So it takes, say, vision, something that's understood quite well, because we have about the same visual system as cats and monkeys, and there are invasive experiments with cats and monkeys that you can't do with humans. So we therefore know about the visual system. The one thing that's known is that if it's not triggered in the first couple of weeks of life, it's gone. The neural system simply degenerates. And the cat, if you raise a cat in blindness for a couple of weeks, it'll be blind permanently because the internal system's degenerated. Has to be triggered by stimulation. In fact, it's even more refined than that. It has to be triggered by pattern stimulation. So if you raise a kitten with diffuse light, it'll be blind permanently. And furthermore, the system that develops depends on the pattern stimulation. So if you give the kitten just vertical lines, no horizontal lines, it'll have a highly refined visual system for vertical lines, but it won't see horizontal lines. That's kind of like the different languages. Every innate system, every instinct is like that. They all have critical periods. You have to trigger them with the proper kind of stimulation during that period. Then they just take off by themselves. And if you don't do it, the systems degenerate. Well, in the case of language, the system doesn't totally degenerate. Like even somebody like me can finally learn enough Italian to ask for a cup of coffee at the bar and so on, you know. But so it's still there somewhere, but in a very rudimentary form. So I don't think there's anything in this respect. Language seems to be like everything else.
Okay, excellent question. Let's take the class is over in a few minutes, but let's take one more question. Is there anything else that somebody would like to ask Noam to finish up? No? Okay. Let's thank our speaker.
Good to talk to him.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.